The pearl necklace felt heavy against her throat as she climbed the courthouse steps, cameras flashing like lightning around her. 63 years of life had taught her that power doesn't announce itself, it whispers. And today, that whisper would become a roar. 5 years ago, they had taken everything from her: her husband, her trust, her certainty about the world. They had infiltrated her life with calculated precision, believing that grief would blind her, that age would weaken her, that a woman who had gracefully stepped away from power would never reclaim it. They were wrong. In Boston's corridors of wealth and influence, they had forgotten the first rule of predators: always confirm your prey is truly defenseless before you strike. Now, as she prepared to detonate 5 years of patient strategy, she remembered something her husband once said before they murdered him. True wealth isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we're willing to sacrifice to protect what matters. Today, they would learn exactly what she was willing to sacrifice. The amber glow of sunset filtered through the stained glass windows of the Sullivan Center for the Arts, casting a warm light across the gathering of Boston's elite. Margaret Sullivan stood at the podium, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, pearl earrings catching the light as she addressed the crowd of 500 who had come to mark the 5th anniversary of her first husband's death. Howard believed that wealth carried responsibility, she said, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion of the day. He often told me that the true measure of success wasn't in what we accumulated, but in what we gave away. From the front row, Richard Coleman watched his wife with undisguised admiration. At 65, he cut an impressive figure tall, distinguished, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to boardrooms and influence. When Margaret's voice faltered slightly, he gave her an encouraging nod, the gold of his wedding band gleaming as he adjusted his tie. Margaret's gaze swept across the familiar faces: politicians, philanthropists, old Boston money, and new tech wealth, all united in their connection to the Sullivan Foundation and its $85 million endowment. 5 years ago, many of these same people had gathered for Howard's funeral, shocked by the sudden death of a man who had seemed indestructible at 68. Howard's legacy continues through each of you, Margaret concluded, through every scholarship funded, every family housed, every senior cared for. Thank you for keeping his vision alive. The applause was generous and genuine. Richard rose immediately, taking her hand as she descended from the stage. His touch was warm, reassuring. Perfect, as always, he murmured, placing a kiss on her cheek. Victoria Hayes approached, elegant in a navy suit that complemented her auburn hair. At 59, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in the corridors of power without seeking the spotlight. The board members are impressed with the new initiatives, Victoria said, embracing Margaret. Howard would be proud. That's all I've ever wanted, Margaret replied, the weight of her pearl necklace, Howard's gift on their 35th anniversary, familiar against her collarbone. As they moved through the reception, accepting condolences and discussing foundation business, Margaret's mind drifted back to that terrible day 5 years ago. Howard had been playing tennis with his old friend, Judge William Peterson, when he suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. By the time the ambulance arrived, Howard Sullivan, philanthropist, business titan, and Margaret's partner of 40 years was gone. The months that followed passed in a blur of grief and responsibility. Margaret, once a formidable attorney before retiring to work alongside Howard, found herself solely responsible for his vast philanthropic empire. She had navigated the transition with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her a feared presence in courtrooms decades earlier. Richard had entered her life 18 months after Howard's death at a fundraiser for the Boston Symphony. His gentle courtship, thoughtful without being presumptuous, respectful of her grief, had been a balm to her lonely existence. When they married 2 years later, the whispers began too soon: gold digger, inappropriate. But at 63, Margaret had discovered that widowhood granted a certain immunity to society's judgments. She had found companionship again, and she refused to apologize for it. Mrs. Sullivan Coleman. A young staff member approached. Your car is ready whenever you'd like to depart. Margaret nodded, suddenly feeling the fatigue of the emotional day. Richard sensed her weariness immediately, making their excuses to the remaining guests and guiding her toward the exit. You were magnificent today, he said, as they settled into the back seat of their Lincoln Navigator. Howard would have been moved by your words. Margaret smiled, leaning against his shoulder as the car pulled away from the curb. The driver navigated through Boston's evening traffic, eventually turning onto the tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill. I was thinking, Richard said, checking his watch. Perhaps we should consider that weekend in Vermont soon. You need a break from foundation business. That sounds lovely, Margaret agreed, watching the familiar scenery pass. After the board meeting next, the impact came without warning, a black SUV slamming into their rear bumper with enough force to jolt them forward against their seatbelts. Before they could recover, another identical vehicle cut in front of them, forcing their driver to brake sharply. What the hell? Richard exclaimed as two men in dark clothing emerged from the front vehicle. Margaret's heart raced, but a lifetime of courtroom confrontations had taught her to think clearly under pressure. Kevin, she addressed their driver. Reverse, now. The young man hesitated only a second before following her command, throwing the Lincoln into reverse and accelerating backward, away from the approaching men. The engine roared as they backed down the narrow street, creating distance. Left here, Margaret instructed, pointing to a side street. Kevin executed a sharp turn, tires screeching against the pavement. The pursuing vehicles recovered quickly, both following as Kevin navigated through increasingly narrow streets. Margaret's mind flashed to the defensive driving course Howard had insisted she take 20 years ago, a precaution he deemed necessary after receiving threats related to his business dealings. There, Marlborough Street, it's one way coming toward us, she directed. They won't be able to follow. Kevin hesitated. Ma'am, that's against, do it, Margaret commanded. The Lincoln lurched forward into the one-way street, forcing oncoming cars to swerve and honk. Behind them, the black SUVs were forced to find alternate routes. Circle back toward Charles Street, Margaret instructed. Then head straight to Beacon Hill. Use the garage entrance, not the front. Richard stared at her, visibly shaken. Where did you learn later? Margaret cut him off, her eyes scanning for any sign of their pursuers. Kevin, call ahead to George. Tell him to activate the security protocols. 20 minutes later, they arrived safely at their Beacon Hill brownstone, entering through the underground garage as Margaret had directed. George, their longtime security guard, met them with a concerned expression. Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, Mr. Coleman, are you hurt? We're fine, George, Margaret assured him, though her hands trembled slightly. But I want the security footage checked immediately, and please review all exterior cameras for the past week. Inside their home, Richard immediately poured 2 glasses of scotch, handing one to Margaret. We need to call the police, he insisted. That was a coordinated attack, not some random road incident. Margaret took a small sip, feeling the liquor burn down her throat. No police, not yet. Margaret, be reasonable. Richard, she set down her glass. In 40 years with Howard, I learned that sometimes publicity only escalates situations. Let me think this through first. Richard's expression was a mixture of concern and frustration. At least let me call a private security firm. We can have additional protection by morning. Margaret nodded, conceding this point. All right, but choose a firm with discretion. After Richard left to make the calls, Margaret moved to Howard's old study, a room she had preserved exactly as he'd left it, from the leather-bound books to the antique globe in the corner. She sank into his chair, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability now that she was alone. The attack was no random incident, the precision, the coordination someone had planned this. But who and why now? 5 years after Howard's death, her eyes fell on Howard's desk calendar, still open to the day he died. Next to it sat the photo of them on their 40th anniversary, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something now forgotten. Howard had been a powerful man with powerful enemies, but those battles were supposed to have died with him. Margaret opened her laptop, entering the complex password that protected the Sullivan Foundation's internal systems. She navigated to the recent projects folder, scanning for anything unusual. Her attention caught on a file labeled Phoenix Project, a $12 million allocation for senior housing that she only vaguely recalled approving. The details seemed in order: a comprehensive development in Dorchester to provide affordable housing for low-income seniors, complete with healthcare facilities and community spaces. Richard had championed it at the last board meeting, citing the critical shortage of senior housing in the city. Margaret picked up her phone, dialing Victoria's number. Margaret, is everything all right? Victoria answered, clearly surprised by the late call. Just following up on some foundation business. Margaret kept her voice casual. The Phoenix Project in Dorchester. When does construction begin? A slight pause. It should be underway already. The board approved the funding 3 months ago. Remember, at the meeting you missed when you had that terrible flu? Margaret's brow furrowed. Of course. And Richard is overseeing it. He's been wonderful about it, Victoria confirmed. Visiting the site weekly, meeting with the contractors. He's really taken to foundation work. Margaret, Howard would have approved. After ending the call, Margaret sat in thoughtful silence. Perhaps she was overreacting. seeing connections where none existed. The attack could have been a random crime, though her instincts screamed otherwise. She turned to Howard's bookshelf, pulling out a volume of Dickens that concealed a small key. The key opened the bottom drawer of his desk, where he had kept his most private papers. Among them, she found a small notebook she'd never noticed before. Flipping through it, most entries were innocuous meeting notes, reminders, until her eye caught a single line: Westlake Connection, Danger. Westlake. The name triggered a distant memory, Howard arguing with someone on the phone, his face flushed with anger. When she'd asked about it later, he dismissed it as business complications. That had been shortly before his death. As she returned the notebook to its hiding place, a heavy envelope slid under the study door. Margaret froze, then moved cautiously to retrieve it. Inside was a photograph Howard with a Latina woman in her 50s and a young girl of perhaps 8 or 9. They were standing in front of what appeared to be a medical facility, the woman's hand resting on Howard's arm with familiar ease. On the back, written in block letters, "Secrets don't stay buried forever." Margaret sank back into Howard's chair, the photograph trembling in her hand. After 40 years of marriage, she had believed she knew everything about her husband. But the woman's posture, the comfortable proximity, this was no casual acquaintance. Sleep eluded Margaret that night. She lay awake beside Richard, listening to his steady breathing, wondering if she should share her discoveries. They had promised no secrets when they married, but instinct honed through years in courtrooms, reading juries and witnesses, told her to wait. The next morning, after Richard left for his regular tennis game, Margaret drove to a small cafe in Boston's North End. Eleanor Walsh was already waiting, a cup of black coffee in front of her, and a second cup Earl Grey with lemon waiting for Margaret. At 68, Eleanor retained the sharp-eyed vigilance that had made her one of Boston's most respected detectives before her retirement. Her silver hair was cut in a practical bob, her clothes simple but immaculate. They had formed an unlikely friendship 30 years ago, when Margaret, then a rising star in the DA's office, had worked with Eleanor on a complex fraud case. "You look like hell," Eleanor observed as Margaret slid into the seat across from her. "Always the charmer," Margaret replied, managing a smile. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice." Eleanor shrugged. "Retirement gets boring." "What's going on?" Margaret described the previous night's attack, then produced the photograph. Eleanor studied it with professional detachment. "You never saw this woman before? Howard never mentioned her." Margaret shook her head. "Never. And there's more." She explained about the Phoenix Project and the cryptic note in Howard's notebook. Eleanor's expression grew serious. "This might be connected to something I've been hearing about. There's been a string of financial manipulations targeting charitable foundations along the eastern seaboard. Professional jobs. Difficult to detect unless you're looking specifically for the patterns." "What kind of patterns?" "Large allocations to legitimate-sounding projects that either never materialize or cost a fraction of the allocated funds. The rest disappears through a maze of shell companies." Eleanor tapped the photograph. "I can run some checks on this woman, discreetly. And maybe take a look at this Phoenix project." "I'd appreciate that," Margaret said. "But please, no official channels yet. I need to understand what I'm dealing with first." Eleanor nodded. "One more thing you should know. These operations I mentioned, they're sophisticated. The people behind them are patient. They infiltrate organizations slowly, build trust, sometimes for years before making significant moves." Margaret felt a chill despite the warm cafe. "You're saying this could have been planned for a long time?" "I'm saying be careful who you trust." Eleanor's gaze was direct. "Even people close to you." As they left the cafe, Margaret noticed a black sedan parked across the street. The same vehicle appeared 3 blocks later as she walked to her car, and again as she drove toward the foundation offices. Someone was following her, not bothering to be particularly subtle about it. Instead of continuing to the office, Margaret made a sudden decision, turning toward Dorchester and the address listed for the Phoenix Project. The sedan maintained its distance, but continued to follow. The neighborhood showed signs of the economic struggles that had plagued this part of Boston for decades. Abandoned storefronts lined streets where hopeful renewal projects had repeatedly stalled. Margaret slowed as she approached the address from the foundation documents, a large lot where an old warehouse should have been undergoing conversion into senior apartments. Instead, she found a decaying building with boarded windows. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but there were no signs of construction, no equipment, no workers, no progress at all. A single weathered sign announced "Future Home of Phoenix Senior Living," with the Sullivan Foundation logo prominently displayed. As Margaret parked across the street, she noticed 2 men removing the sign. She approached cautiously. "Excuse me, what's happening with the Phoenix Project?" The older of the 2 men shrugged. "Couldn't tell you, lady. We just got hired to take down the signage. Project's been canceled." From what I heard, canceled when, about a week ago, developer pulled out, according to the work order. Margaret thanked him and walked back to her car. Mind racing. The board had approved $12 million for this project. If construction had never started, where had the money gone? The black sedan was still parked a block away, its driver pretending to check something on his phone. Margaret took a photo of the vehicle with her phone, capturing the license plate, then drove away, making a complex series of turns designed to determine if she was still being followed. The sedan appeared and disappeared throughout her route, confirming her suspicions. Instead of returning home, Margaret drove to the exclusive Harvard Club, where she knew William Peterson would be having his customary Wednesday lunch. The 80-year-old retired federal judge had been Howard's closest friend and confidant for over 40 years. William was alone at his usual corner table, a half-eaten club sandwich and the Wall Street Journal before him. His face brightened when he saw Margaret. "My dear," he rose with old-fashioned courtesy, kissing her cheek. "What a pleasant surprise." "I'm sorry to interrupt your lunch." "William," Margaret said, taking the seat he offered. "Nonsense. I've been hoping you'd call. Richard mentioned you've been overwhelmed with foundation business lately." Margaret studied William's face, the deep lines around kind eyes that had seen decades of human frailty from the bench. If anyone would give her honest counsel, it would be William. "I need your advice," she said quietly. "Something's happening with the foundation, and I'm not sure who I can trust." William's expression grew serious. He signaled the waiter for privacy, then leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Margaret recounted the events of the past 24 hours, the attack, the photograph, the abandoned project site, and the surveillance. William listened without interruption, his judicial temperament evident in his careful attention. "Howard suspected something like this might happen," he said finally. "About 6 months before he died, he added a special clause to the foundation charter, a dissolution provision that would allow you, and only you, to dissolve the current board in case of emergency." Margaret stared at him. "He never told me about this. He didn't want to worry you. But he sensed something was wrong, especially after the confrontations with Westlake." "Westlake," Margaret repeated. "I found that name in Howard's notes. What connection did Howard have with them?" "Westlake Development was trying to acquire properties in neighborhoods where the Sullivan Foundation had community projects. Howard blocked them several times, prevented them from displacing vulnerable residents." William's expression darkened. "Their CEO, Jonathan Pierce, made threats implied that Howard would regret interfering with their business interests." "You think they could be behind what's happening now?" William shook his head. "I don't know. But I do know that Howard created safeguards because he was concerned about internal threats as well as external ones. William stopped abruptly, his gaze focused on something over Margaret's shoulder. She turned to see Richard entering the dining room with another man tall, expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to power. "Jonathan Pierce," William murmured, "CEO of Westlake Development." Margaret watched as Richard and Pierce were seated at a table across the room, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Richard hadn't noticed her presence yet. "Quite a coincidence," she said quietly. William's expression was grim. "In my experience, there are very few coincidences in matters like these." "What should I do?" "William," the old judge considered for a moment, "proceed with extreme caution. Gather information, identify your allies, and prepare to use Howard's dissolution provision if necessary. But remember, once you invoke it, there's no turning back. You'll make powerful enemies." As Margaret prepared to leave, William held her arm gently. "One more thing. Howard amended his will just weeks before he died. He left something for you in a safety deposit box at Boston Trust. The key should be with his personal effects." "A safety deposit box?" He never mentioned it. "He said you'd know when it was time to open it." William's eyes held a sadness that made Margaret's heart constrict. "Be careful, Margaret. Howard valued nothing more than the Foundation's mission, and you—" Driving home, Margaret's mind whirled with questions. What was Richard doing with the CEO of Westlake? What secrets had Howard kept from her? And most troubling if Eleanor was right about long-term infiltration. How long had this been planned, and by whom, back at home? Margaret went directly to Howard's study. She unlocked the antique desk drawer where she'd placed his personal effects after the funeral, his wallet, watch, wedding ring, and keys. Among them was a small key she hadn't recognized, with a numbered tag Boston Trust. Box 1949, the year of Howard's birth. Before she could consider her next move, she heard Richard entering the house, calling her name. She quickly replaced everything and closed the drawer. "Margaret, are you home?" "In the study," she called back, composing herself. Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned. I've been trying to reach you all day. After what happened last night, I was worried. I needed some time to think, Margaret said. I visited the Phoenix Project site today. A flicker of something surprised concern crossed Richard's face. The Dorchester property, why? Because I realized I knew very little about a $12 million project our foundation is funding. Margaret watched him carefully. Imagine my surprise when I found an abandoned building and workers removing our sign. Richard sighed, loosening his tie as he sat in the leather chair opposite her. I was going to tell you at dinner tonight. The developer pulled out last week some zoning complications. We're already looking for a replacement to keep the project on track. That's funny, because Victoria seemed to think construction was already underway. She said you've been visiting the site weekly? Richard's laugh seemed forced. Poor Victoria, she gets so many projects confused these days. I've been visiting the preliminary meetings with contractors, not the site itself. You know how these development projects go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Margaret nodded, revealing nothing of her skepticism. I saw you at the Harvard Club today, with Jonathan Pierce. Richard's expression registered genuine surprise. You were there, I didn't see you? I was having lunch with William Peterson. He mentioned that Pierce's company had conflicts with Howard before his death. Richard's shoulders relaxed slightly. Ah, yes. Ancient history. Pierce approached me about potentially partnering on some community development initiatives. I thought it might be time to mend fences. It's been 5 years. After all, Howard would want the foundation to use every resource available to further its mission. His explanation was reasonable, even laudable. Yet Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, a prosecutor's instinct for evasion and half-truths. I'd like to be included in any future meetings with Westlake, she said. Given the history? Of course, Richard agreed readily. No more solo meetings, I promise. Now, should we dress for dinner? I made reservations at Soralina. As Richard left to shower and change, Margaret remained in Howard's study, troubled by the ease of his explanations. Either she was becoming paranoid, or Richard was an exceptionally skilled liar. Neither possibility was comforting. She quietly entered Howard's private bathroom, connected to the study, and opened the medicine cabinet. Among Howard's old prescriptions and toiletries, she found what she was looking for, a small electronic device that Howard had shown her years ago, designed to detect surveillance equipment. Howard had been perhaps overly cautious about corporate espionage, but now Margaret was grateful for his paranoia. Over the next hour, while Richard prepared for dinner, she systematically swept their bedroom, the study, and her home office. The device remained silent until she reached the bookshelf in her office, where it emitted a soft beep near a decorative clock, a gift from Richard on their first anniversary. Inside, she found a sophisticated listening device, small enough to be easily overlooked. Margaret's blood ran cold. She carefully replaced the clock exactly as it had been, her mind racing. If there was one device, there were likely others, and if Richard had placed them, he now had access to her private conversations, including potentially her meeting with Eleanor. At dinner that night, Margaret maintained a perfect facade of normalcy, discussing foundation business and social engagements as if nothing had changed. Richard was attentive as always, refilling her wine glass, asking about her plans for the upcoming weekend. I was thinking, he said as they shared a dessert, perhaps we should consider bringing some new blood onto the foundation board, younger perspectives, fresh ideas. Did you have someone specific in mind? Margaret asked, forcing a smile. Jonathan Pierce suggested his daughter might be interested. She has an MBA from Wharton, experience in urban development, could be a valuable addition. Margaret took a small bite of tiramisu, buying time to control her response. Interesting suggestion. Let's discuss it with the current board first. I want Victoria's input, certainly. Of course, Richard agreed smoothly. Just planting seeds for the future. Seeds, indeed, Margaret thought. Seeds of control, of infiltration, exactly as Eleanor had described. That night, after Richard fell asleep, Margaret lay awake planning her next moves. She needed to access that safety deposit box, investigate the Phoenix Project funds, and somehow determine if Richard was connected to the attack on their car, all without alerting him to her suspicions. Most critically, she needed to find the woman in the photograph with Howard. If someone was using Howard's past to threaten her, she needed to understand exactly what secrets her husband had kept. The next morning, Margaret told Richard she had a hair appointment followed by lunch with an old law school friend. Instead, she drove directly to Boston Trust, the private bank where Howard had kept the mysterious safety deposit box. The bank manager, recognizing her immediately, escorted her to the vault himself. Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, it's been some time since we've seen you. Life gets busy, Margaret replied with a practiced social smile. I appreciate your assistance. Left alone in the private viewing room with the box, Margaret inserted the key with trembling fingers. Inside, she found a sealed envelope addressed to her in Howard's familiar handwriting, a USB drive, and a smaller box containing a single key with a Providence address taped to it. She opened the letter first. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, I am gone, and you have discovered something that has led you to this box. I hope it was not trouble that brought you here, but I fear it may be. For the past 10 years, I have been supporting a medical research and rehabilitation center in Providence, the Martinez Rehabilitation Institute. The woman you may have seen me with is Sophia Martinez, a brilliant neurologist who approached me with a groundbreaking treatment protocol for elderly patients with mobility issues. I kept this project separate from the Foundation for protection not from you, but from others who might exploit it. The treatment protocols being developed there could be worth billions if commercialized, but Sophia and I agreed they should remain accessible to all, not controlled by pharmaceutical interests. Sophia can be trusted completely. The key enclosed will open her private office at the Institute. If you're reading this, seek her out. There have been threats. Margaret, Westlake Development is only the public face of interest that would destroy everything we've built. I've taken precautions, documented on the enclosed drive, but I fear it may not be enough. Trust William. Trust Eleanor Walsh. If you still know her, trust Victoria, who has stood by us for 30 years. But be careful, my love. Power and money attract predators, and our foundation has both in abundance. I have loved you every day of our life together. Whatever happens, remember that the Foundation's mission helping those who cannot help themselves is what gives meaning to our privilege. Always. Howard Margaret read the letter twice, her heart pounding. Howard had kept secrets not an affair, as the photograph might have suggested, but a separate charitable project. Why hadn't he told her? What threats had concerned him enough to create this elaborate safeguard? She slipped the USB drive into her purse along with the key to Sophia's office. The letter she read once more before reluctantly returning it to the box. Richard might notice if it went missing, and she couldn't risk alerting him yet. As she drove toward Providence, Margaret called Eleanor from a burner phone she'd purchased that morning. I need everything you can find on the Martinez Rehabilitation Institute in Providence, she said when Eleanor answered. And I need you to look into Richard's background before he came to Boston. Already working on it, Eleanor replied. And Margaret, that Phoenix project. The foundation transferred the full $12 million to a developer called Horizon Builders 3 months ago. Horizon doesn't exist anymore. It dissolved 2 weeks after receiving the funds. Margaret's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Where did the money go? Working on that, too? But here's something interesting. Richard Coleman wasn't always Richard Coleman. Until about 10 years ago, he was Richard Caldwell, CFO of 3 different charitable foundations in the Mid-Atlantic region. All 3 experienced financial irregularities after he left. You're saying he's done this before? I'm saying the pattern matches. Be careful, Margaret. I'll keep digging. The Martinez Rehabilitation Institute was housed in a modern building on the outskirts of Providence, its glass and steel architecture projecting an image of clinical innovation. Inside, the reception area was warm and welcoming, with comfortable seating and natural light flooding through large windows. I'm here to see Dr. Sophia Martinez, Margaret told the receptionist. My name is Margaret Sullivan. The young woman's eyes widened slightly. Mrs. Sullivan. Of course, Dr. Martinez mentioned you might visit someday. Let me see if she's available. A few minutes later, a striking woman in her early 60s appeared, her dark hair streaked with silver, her white coat impeccable over a simple black dress. She approached Margaret with a warm smile of recognition. Margaret, I've waited a long time to meet you properly. Her accent held traces of her native Columbia. Howard spoke of you constantly. I wish I could say the same about you, Margaret replied, keeping her voice low. I only learned of your existence yesterday. Sophia's smile faltered. He didn't tell you even after... She stopped, glancing around the busy reception area. Perhaps we should speak privately. My office. Margaret followed Sophia through corridors where elderly patients worked with therapists on various mobility exercises. The facility was clearly state-of-the-art, with equipment Margaret had never seen before. Sophia's office was modest but elegant, with medical degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins displayed alongside photographs of elderly patients standing independently, their faces beaming with achievement. Howard funded all of this? Margaret asked, taking in the extensive facility. Every dollar, Sophia confirmed. 10 years ago, I approached him with a treatment protocol that could help elderly patients regain mobility after strokes or injuries. Traditional medical investors wanted to patent everything, charge thousands per treatment. Howard understood my vision, making these techniques available to everyone, regardless of wealth. Why didn't he tell me? Sophia sighed, gesturing for Margaret to sit. He wanted to, especially after the threats began, but he was concerned that knowledge might put you in danger. What threats? At first, just financial pressure, companies trying to buy us out. Then more direct intimidation break-ins at the facility. Patients followed. Sophia's expression darkened. 2 years ago, my granddaughter's school received a bomb threat. The message was clear: sell the patents or suffer consequences. Margaret thought of the photograph she'd received. You have a granddaughter. Is she about 13 now? Sophia, named after me. She was 8 when Howard took that photograph of us at the opening of this facility. Sophia's eyes widened. You've seen it, how Margaret described the envelope slipped under her door. I believe someone is using Howard's connection to you as leverage, though I don't understand why yet. Sophia paled. It's starting again. After Howard died, the pressure stopped. I thought perhaps his death was coincidence, but you think his death wasn't natural? Margaret interrupted, her heart pounding. Howard was in perfect health, Sophia said quietly. The heart attack was unexpected, medically unusual. I suggested an autopsy, but was told the family you had declined. I never declined anything, Margaret whispered. The doctors said it was clearly a massive coronary. There was no suggestion of she couldn't finish the sentence, the implication too horrifying. Sophia reached for Margaret's hand. I may be wrong. Doctors see suspicious patterns where none exist, especially after losing someone we care about. Howard left me a letter directing me to you, Margaret said, refocusing. He mentioned a key to your private office. Understanding dawned in Sophia's eyes. The records room. It's in the basement. She stood, moving to a bookshelf where she pressed a hidden switch, revealing a concealed door. Howard insisted on this level of security. At the time, I thought he was being paranoid. They descended a narrow staircase to a small, windowless room filled with filing cabinets and a computer workstation. Sophia gestured to a cabinet in the corner. That one requires Howard's key. I've never opened it. Margaret inserted the key from the safety deposit box, turning it with a satisfying click. Inside were dozens of folders, meticulously labeled with names of companies, individuals, and dates. She recognized some immediately major pharmaceutical corporations, investment firms with healthcare divisions, and at the very front, a thick folder labeled Westlake Synergy Connection. Synergy? Margaret questioned. Synergy Healthcare Partners, Sophia explained. They approached us repeatedly about buying our treatment protocols. Their CEO, Jonathan Pierce, was particularly aggressive. Pierce is also CEO of Westlake Development, Margaret said, the connections crystallizing in her mind. He's currently trying to partner with the Sullivan Foundation through my husband. Sophia's expression grew alarmed. Margaret, these people are dangerous. If they're targeting the foundation now... A sudden commotion upstairs interrupted her. Raised voices, the sound of breaking glass. Sophia moved quickly to a security monitor on the wall, activating it to reveal the reception area. 2 men in dark suits were confronting the receptionist, showing what appeared to be badges. Federal agents, Sophia said, her voice tight. They've come before, claiming regulatory investigations, always after we've refused acquisition offers. Margaret gathered the Westlake Synergy folder and several others. Is there another way out? Sophia nodded, moving to a corner of the room where she pulled back a rug to reveal a trap door. Maintenance tunnel. Howard's idea, he said every research facility should have an escape route. Howard thought of everything, Margaret muttered as she followed Sophia into the dark tunnel, illuminated only by emergency lighting. He was trying to protect all of us, Sophia replied, leading the way through the narrow passage. The question is, who's trying to hurt us now? They emerged 10 minutes later in a parking garage a block from the Institute. Margaret could hear sirens approaching in the distance. You should come with me, she told Sophia. If they're searching for records, they might detain you for questioning. Sophia hesitated, then nodded. Let me text my assistant to handle things here. I can't risk being prevented from treating my patients. They drove back toward Boston in tense silence, Margaret processing the implications of what she'd learned. If Howard had been investigating connections between Westlake Development and Synergy Healthcare, and if Richard was now meeting with Pierce, the coincidence seemed too great. Howard suspected someone had infiltrated the foundation. Margaret finally said, in his letter, he mentioned threats from within, not just external pressure. That would explain his increased security measures in the final year. Sophia agreed. He became almost obsessive about documentation, keeping records separate, creating redundant systems. Did he ever mention any one specific board member's staff? Sophia considered carefully. He was concerned about new appointments to the board, said there was pressure to bring in people connected to Synergy's interests, and he mentioned a new financial advisor he didn't trust, someone the board had insisted on hiring against his recommendation. Margaret's blood ran cold. When was this? Perhaps 6 months before he died. I don't recall the name, but Howard said the man had connections to other foundations that had experienced financial problems, just like Richard's previous positions, according to Eleanor. Margaret's mind raced, trying to connect the pieces. Had Richard Caldwell been planted in those other foundations as well? Was he part of a larger scheme targeting multiple charitable organizations as they approached the outskirts of Boston? Margaret noticed a black sedan 2 cars behind them, the same vehicle that had followed her the previous day. She made a sudden turn down a side street, watching in the rearview mirror as the sedan followed. "We're being followed," she told Sophia calmly. "Hold on." Margaret executed a series of rapid turns through residential streets, utilizing the defensive driving techniques she'd learned years ago. The sedan kept pace initially, but after a particularly sharp turn down a narrow alley, they emerged onto a main road with no sign of their pursuer. "That was impressive," Sophia remarked, her knuckles white from gripping the dashboard. "Let's hope it bought us some time," Margaret replied, heading toward Eleanor's address rather than her home. "We need to regroup and figure out our next." The impact came from nowhere, a pickup truck ramming into the passenger side of their car at an intersection, sending them spinning across the road. Margaret fought for control, but the airbags deployed, momentarily disorienting her. As the car came to a stop against a streetlight, she turned to check on Sophia. The neurologist was slumped against her seatbelt, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. Outside, Margaret could hear approaching sirens and concerned shouts from witnesses. The pickup truck was already speeding away, its driver clearly uninterested in exchanging insurance information. This was no accident. It was a message or an attempted silencing. As emergency responders surrounded the vehicle, Margaret reached for Sophia's hand, finding a weak pulse. "Hold on," she whispered. "Just hold on." Hours later, Margaret sat in the waiting room of Massachusetts General Hospital, her own minor injuries treated and bandaged. Eleanor Walsh paced nearby, having arrived shortly after Margaret called from the ambulance. "Sophia's in surgery," Margaret explained, her voice hollow. "Head trauma, internal bleeding. They're not certain." Eleanor nodded grimly. "I've arranged for a police guard outside her room. Officially, they're there because it was a hit and run, but I've briefed the lieutenant. He knows there might be additional concerns." "Thank you." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion washing over her. "What have you found about Richard?" Eleanor sat beside her, keeping her voice low. Richard Caldwell worked for 3 foundations over a 10-year period. Each experienced significant financial losses attributed to mismanagement or failed investments. No criminal charges were ever filed, but the pattern is consistent large allocations to development projects that never materialized. "Just like the Phoenix Project," Margaret murmured. "Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting after each foundation scandal. Properties owned by those foundations were acquired by subsidiary companies, eventually linked back to Westlake Development." Margaret felt sick. They target foundations for their real estate assets, drain the funds, devalue the organization, then swoop in to acquire the properties at reduced prices. "It's brilliant, in a twisted way," Eleanor agreed. "Charitable foundations often hold valuable real estate in urban centers, acquired decades ago when prices were lower. The Sullivan Foundation owns, 30 properties across Boston. 37, Margaret corrected automatically. Worth well over $100 million in today's market. A tempting target, Eleanor hesitated. "There's more." I ran background on Victoria Hayes. Victoria, she's been with the foundation for 30 years. Howard trusted her completely. Which makes this odd? Eleanor handed Margaret a file. 2 months before Howard died, Victoria's brother received a director position at Synergy Healthcare. Coincidence, perhaps, but worth noting. Margaret stared at the documentation, her world tilting further. If Victoria was compromised, who could she trust the foundation's structure? Howard's legacy, everything she valued, was potentially corrupted. A doctor approached, still wearing surgical scrubs. "Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, doctor, Martinez is out of surgery. The next 24 hours will be critical, but if she makes it through the night, her prognosis is cautiously optimistic. Can I see her? She's in recovery now, then moving to intensive care, perhaps tomorrow." The doctor hesitated. "The police are treating this as a suspicious accident. Should I expect investigators to interview her when she regains consciousness?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "And please, no visitors except those cleared by the police guard." After the doctor left, Eleanor touched Margaret's arm. You can't go home tonight. Richard will expect you to return after your supposed hair appointment and lunch. I've already called him, Margaret replied. Told him about the accident. Said I was staying at the hospital with an old friend who was injured. He offered to come, but I discouraged it. Good. You'll stay at my place tonight. We need to plan our next steps carefully. As they left the hospital through a service entrance to avoid potential surveillance, Margaret's phone chimed with a text from James, her son from her first marriage, a successful investigative journalist for the Boston Chronicle. James had been traveling for work and was unreachable for the past week. Mom, back in town. Need to talk urgently. Something big happening with Foundation. Call me. Margaret showed Eleanor the message. Your son might be exactly the ally we need right now, Eleanor observed, especially if he's already investigating independently. I'll call him from your place, Margaret decided. Not on this phone, it might be compromised. As they drove through Boston's evening traffic, Margaret gazed at the city lights reflecting off the Charles River. Somewhere in that glittering landscape, Richard was waiting, perhaps wondering if his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Victoria was potentially betraying a 30-year friendship. And Howard's legacy, the foundation that had helped thousands of Boston's most vulnerable residents, was under siege from within. What's our next move? Eleanor asked as they approached her modest townhouse in Jamaica Plain. Margaret's expression hardened with determination. We gather allies, collect evidence, and then we use Howard's dissolution provision to clean house completely and permanently. It won't be easy, Eleanor warned. These people have planned for years, built layers of protection and deniability. They've never faced me in a courtroom, Margaret replied, her voice taking on the steely edge that at once made opposing counsel quake. They're about to discover that was a serious miscalculation. Inside Eleanor's home, Margaret used a secure line to call James. His phone went immediately to voicemail. She left a brief message asking him to meet her at Eleanor's address, mentioning nothing about her suspicions. As she ended the call, a breaking news alert appeared on Eleanor's television. A reporter stood outside the Martinez Rehabilitation Institute, which was now cordoned off with crime scene tape. Federal agents raided the facility this afternoon, the reporter announced, acting on anonymous tips about medical fraud and insurance violations. During the operation, an unidentified man attacked officers and was shot while attempting to access restricted records. The suspect is in critical condition and has not yet been identified. Margaret and Eleanor exchanged alarmed glances. Those records we took, Margaret whispered. Someone was willing to die to prevent them from being found. Or to retrieve them after learning you'd access them, Eleanor added grimly. Either way, the stakes just got higher. Eleanor's phone rang a contact from her days on the force. She listened intently, her expression growing increasingly concerned. That was Detective Rodriguez, she said after hanging up. James hasn't been at the Chronicle office for 3 days. His editor reported him missing this morning after he missed a major deadline, completely out of character. Margaret sank onto the couch, her composure finally cracking. They have my son. We don't know that for certain, Eleanor cautioned, though her tone lacked conviction. First Sophia, now James. Margaret's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and rage. They're systematically removing anyone who might help me understand what's happening, which means they know you're investigating, Eleanor said. Your home, your phones, possibly your car, all compromised. Margaret stared at the files they'd recovered from Sophia's office, spread across Eleanor's coffee table. Then we need to move faster than they expect. Tonight, we review everything. Tomorrow, we begin reaching out to trusted board members, those Howard appointed personally, not recent additions. And Richard, he'll notice your extended absence? Margaret's expression hardened. Let him wonder. Let him worry. It's time Richard Coleman discovered who he's really married to. As night fell over Boston, Margaret Sullivan prepared for battle not in a courtroom this time, but for control of her husband's legacy and possibly for the lives of those she loved. The comfortable widow who had retreated from professional life was gone, replaced by the formidable attorney who had once made Boston's criminal elite tremble at the mention of her name. The predators who had infiltrated the Sullivan Foundation were about to face their most dangerous adversary, yet a woman with nothing left to lose. Dawn broke over Boston with a somber gray light that matched Margaret's mood. She had slept fitfully on Eleanor's spare bed, her dreams haunted by images of Howard, Sophia, and James in danger. By 6 at me, she was already at Eleanor's kitchen table, reviewing the files they'd recovered from the Martinez Institute. The Westlake Synergy connection was more extensive than she'd imagined. Howard had meticulously documented meetings, phone calls, and suspicious activities dating back nearly 7 years. Most troublingly, He'd compiled a list of charitable foundations that had been targeted before the Sullivan Foundation, each following the same pattern: financial irregularities, devaluation, and eventual acquisition of prime real estate assets by Westlake subsidiaries. And on a page dated just 2 weeks before his death, Howard had written a single name that made Margaret's blood run cold: Richard Caldwell, chief financial manipulator. He knew, Margaret whispered. Howard identified Richard before he died. Eleanor, placing a cup of coffee before her, peered at the document. If Howard suspected Richard was targeting the foundation, why didn't he act immediately? Because he was gathering evidence? Margaret realized, flipping through more pages. Look at these notes. He was building a comprehensive case, documenting every connection. Howard never made accusations without irrefutable proof. A trait you share, Eleanor observed, settling across from her with her own coffee. Margaret's phone chimed with a text from Richard. Worried about you? Coming to hospital this morning to check on your friend. Which room? He's trying to locate me. Margaret showed Eleanor the message. Don't respond yet, Eleanor advised. We need to control the flow of information. Margaret nodded, returning to the files. Here, look at this. She pointed to financial records Howard had compiled. 3 months before his death, the Foundation Board approved a significant restructuring of investment protocols, reducing Howard's direct oversight of major allocations, setting the stage for future manipulations. Eleanor agreed. Who proposed these changes? Margaret scanned the documents. The Finance Committee, chaired by... Her voice faltered. Victoria Hayes. The betrayal cut deep. Victoria had been more than an employee. She'd been a friend, a confidant through Howard's illness and death, a support during Margaret's grief. The thought that she might have been undermining Howard's legacy all along was almost unbearable. We need to consider the possibility that Howard's death wasn't natural, Eleanor said quietly. Given the timing and what we've discovered, Margaret closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. I've been thinking the same thing, but proving it after 5 years would be nearly impossible. Not necessarily, came a male voice from the doorway. Both women turned sharply to see James Sullivan leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face bruised, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. At 42, he had Howard's height and build, but Margaret's intense dark eyes that now reflected pain and exhaustion. James, Margaret rushed to her son, embracing him carefully. My God, what happened to you? Occupational hazard of investigating Westlake development, he replied grimly, allowing them to help him to a chair. Been working on a story about their real estate acquisitions for months. 3 days ago, someone grabbed me outside my apartment, took my phone, my notes, everything. Are you seriously hurt? Margaret examined the crude bandage with motherly concern. Knife wound, but shallow. I treated it myself. He winced as he sat. Couldn't risk a hospital they'd be watching. Managed to escape last night when they moved me between locations. Eleanor brought him water and pain relievers. You need proper medical attention. Later, James insisted. Right now, you need to hear what I've learned. Mom, the Sullivan Foundation is just the latest target in a systematic scheme that's been operating for at least 15 years. Westlake and Synergy are front companies for a network that identifies charitable foundations with valuable real estate assets, infiltrates them through board appointments or key staff positions, then systematically drains their resources. We've pieced some of this together, Margaret said, gesturing to the files. Howard was investigating the same network before he died. James nodded grimly. I found connections to at least 7 major foundations along the eastern seaboard, all following the same pattern. But the Sullivan Foundation is their biggest target, yet the real estate holdings alone are worth over $100 million. And Richard? Margaret asked, dreading the answer. Richard Coleman, formerly Caldwell, is their specialist, James confirmed. He's played this role at least 3 times before marrying or becoming romantically involved with someone in foundation leadership, using that position to influence financial decisions. In Charlotte, he was engaged to the foundation president's daughter. In Philadelphia, he married the treasurer, a marriage that conveniently ended once the foundation's assets were liquidated. Margaret felt physically ill. Our entire marriage has been a lie. Not just a lie, James added, a calculated strategic move. After Howard identified Richard as a threat, they needed to neutralize and control you after his death. Richard was their solution. Eleanor, ever practical, refocused the conversation. You mentioned proving Howard's death wasn't natural. What did you mean? James pulled a flash drive from his pocket. I was working with a source inside Synergy, a whistleblower, who claimed to have evidence of criminal activity, including potential involvement in Howard's death. The day before I was abducted, she sent me this, then disappeared. He inserted the drive into Eleanor's laptop, opening a folder of documents. Among them was a medical report, a toxicology analysis dated 1 week after Howard's death. This was never released to the family, James explained. My source claims it was suppressed. According to this report, Howard had traces of a compound that can induce cardiac symptoms identical to a natural heart attack, difficult to detect unless specifically screened for. Margaret read the report with growing horror. This suggests Howard was murdered. And the order to cremate his body came unusually quickly, James added. Supposedly at your request. I never requested cremation, Margaret whispered. Howard had always wanted to be buried beside my mother in Mount Auburn Cemetery. The doctor said cremation was your preference. Another manipulation, Eleanor observed, ensuring no further testing could be done. Margaret's shock was giving way to cold fury. Her husband hadn't simply died, he had been murdered for attempting to protect his foundation, and she had unknowingly married one of the people potentially responsible. The question is, Eleanor said, how do we proceed? We have compelling evidence, but much of it would be considered circumstantial in court. We don't need the courts yet, Margaret replied, her attorney's mind calculating strategies. We need to invoke Howard's dissolution provision, remove the compromised board members, and secure the foundation's assets before they can be further diminished. You'll need support from uncompromised board members, James pointed out. Margaret nodded. William Peterson will help us, and there are 3 others Howard appointed personally that I believe we can trust. We need to gather them immediately today before Richard realizes what we're doing. And Victoria, Eleanor asked. We keep her close but tell her nothing, Margaret decided. If she's involved, I want to see exactly how deep the betrayal goes. James winced as he shifted in his chair. There's one more thing you should know. The night I was abducted, I overheard my captors discussing a board meeting scheduled for tomorrow, something about finalizing transfers before the old lady catches on. Margaret checked the foundation calendar on her phone. There's no board meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Exactly, James said grimly. They're making their move, with or without your knowledge. Margaret's resolve hardened. Then we make ours first. Eleanor, can you get James proper medical attention discreetly, James? I need everything you've gathered on Westlake and Synergy consolidated and backed up securely. What will you do? Eleanor asked. Margaret stood, her posture straightening with determination. I'm going to the bank to activate Howard's contingency plans. Then I'm calling William to assemble the board members we can trust. By this afternoon, we'll be ready to confront Richard and his allies. Be careful, James warned. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to kill. So am I, Margaret replied with a coldness that surprised even her. Anyone who threatens my family or Howard's legacy will learn exactly why prosecutors once called me the surgeon. I cut precisely, and I cut deep. An hour later, Margaret sat in a private conference room at Boston Trust, her father's longtime bank. William Peterson had joined her, bringing with him Howard's personal attorney, Samuel Goldman, a meticulous man in his 70s who had handled the Sullivan family's legal affairs for over 40 years. The dissolution provision is legally sound, Samuel confirmed, reviewing the document. As the primary beneficiary and chair emeritus, you have the authority to dissolve the current board and appoint interim leadership in cases of suspected malfeasance. And you're certain malfeasance is occurring? William asked, his judicial temperament demanding precision. Margaret laid out the evidence they'd gathered the Phoenix Project fraud, Richard's previous identities and patterns, Victoria's family connection to Synergy, and Howard's documented concerns before his death. I believe Howard was murdered to prevent him from exposing this scheme, she concluded. And I believe my son was abducted for the same reason. William's expression grew grave. These are extraordinary allegations. Margaret, if you invoke the dissolution provision, you'll face immediate legal challenges from removed board members. Let them challenge, Margaret replied. By then, we'll have secured the foundation's assets and launched a formal investigation. Even the appearance of impropriety will force most of them to distance themselves rather than face public scrutiny. Samuel nodded approvingly. A classic Margaret Sullivan strategy: apply pressure where the opposition is most vulnerable. In this case, their public reputations. I'll need both of you present when I convene the emergency session, Margaret said. Your standing in the community will lend credibility to our actions. Of course, William agreed. When do you plan to move? This afternoon. I've already contacted the 3 board members Howard appointed personally, Elizabeth Chin, Robert Daniels, and Martin Washington. All have agreed to meet at the foundation offices at 3 o'clock. And Richard, Samuel inquired delicately. I've told him I'm still at the hospital with my injured friend. He believes I'll be occupied until this evening. Margaret's expression hardened. I want him completely blindsided. As they finalized their strategy, Margaret's phone rang. Victoria Hayes. I should take this, Margaret said, then answered with practiced normalcy. Victoria, good morning. Margaret, thank goodness. I've been trying to reach you. Victoria's voice carried genuine sounding concern. Richard called. Said you were at the hospital with a friend. Is everything all right? A car accident, Margaret replied smoothly. My old law school classmate was injured. I've been with her since yesterday. I'm so sorry, Victoria said. Is there anything I can do? Actually, yes. Could you gather the latest financial reports for my review? I've been neglecting foundation business lately and want to catch up. I'll stop by this afternoon. A slight pause. Of course. Although, Richard mentioned he was handling the quarterly review himself to give you a break. That's thoughtful of him. But I'd like to stay involved. Margaret kept her tone casual. Richard sometimes forgets I was managing complex legal matters long before we met. Victoria laughed, the sound unnervingly natural. He does tend to be overprotective. I'll have everything ready by 3. Perfect. See you then. After ending the call, Margaret turned to William and Samuel. She'll alert Richard immediately. Good, William said. Let's see how he reacts. Margaret's prediction proved accurate. Within 10 minutes, Richard called, his voice carrying forced casualness. Darling, Victoria mentioned you're coming to the office today. I thought you were staying with your friend. She's stabilized, Margaret replied, and I realized I've been neglecting foundation matters. Thought I'd review some reports while waiting for visiting hours. You work too hard, Richard chided gently. I've been handling everything specifically, so you could take a break. Why don't I bring the reports to you? We could have lunch near the hospital. That's sweet, but I need access to the full financial database. Margaret infused her voice with a slight confusion of someone who doesn't understand why their simple request is meeting resistance. Is there some reason you don't want me at the office? Of course not. Richard backpedaled smoothly. I just worry about you overextending yourself. I'll see you there, then, 3 o'clock. Looking forward to it, Margaret replied, ending the call with a grim smile. He's suspicious, William observed. Good, Margaret said. Suspicious people make mistakes. By 2:30, Margaret had positioned trusted security personnel, retired police officers, recommended by Eleanor at strategic locations throughout the foundation building. Samuel had prepared the legal documents required to invoke the dissolution provision, and William had briefed the 3 trusted board members on what to expect. Margaret herself had changed into her courtroom armor, a meticulously tailored navy suit that had once made a defendant whisper to his attorney that he felt like he was facing his own execution. Her pearl necklace, Howard's last gift, completed the ensemble, a reminder of what she was fighting to protect. As she entered the Sullivan Foundation headquarters, the security guard at the front desk, a new face, straightened immediately. Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, we weren't expecting you today. Clearly, Margaret replied coolly, noting the visitor's log showing Jonathan Pierce had been in the building earlier. Please don't announce my arrival. I'd like to review some materials before my meeting. Instead of going to her own office, Margaret went directly to the executive conference room, where Eleanor's team had already swept for surveillance devices and installed their own recording equipment. The 3 trusted board members arrived shortly thereafter, followed by William and Samuel. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Margaret began once they were settled. What I'm about to share will be disturbing, but I need your complete attention and discretion. For the next 20 minutes, she methodically presented the evidence they'd gathered: the Phoenix Project fraud, the pattern of similar schemes at other foundations, Richard's previous identities, the suspicious circumstances of Howard's death, and the unauthorized board meeting planned for the following day. Elizabeth Chen, a pediatric surgeon who had worked with Howard on children's healthcare initiatives, was the first to respond. This is overwhelming. You're suggesting a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of our organization. Not suggesting, Margaret corrected, proving. The documentation is extensive and compelling. Robert Daniels, a retired bank executive who had been Howard's classmate at Harvard, studied the financial records with growing alarm. These transfers are highly irregular. The Phoenix Project allocation should have had multiple approval checkpoints. How did this bypass our standard protocols? Because the protocols were quietly modified last year, Margaret explained. A procedural change that seemed minor at the time but created vulnerabilities in our oversight system. Martin Washington, a community leader from Roxbury who had partnered with the foundation on urban renewal projects, shook his head in disbelief. I noticed some of our neighborhood initiatives were being delayed or underfunded, but I had no idea it was part of a systematic dismantling. which is why we must act immediately, Margaret pressed. Howard anticipated this possibility and created a legal mechanism to protect the foundation, the dissolution provision that allows me, with cause, to dissolve the current board and appoint interim leadership until a proper investigation can be completed. Samuel distributed copies of the legal documents. This provision is unorthodox but entirely legal. Mrs. Sullivan Coleman has both the authority and the evidence required to invoke it. William leaned forward, his judicial presence commanding attention. I've reviewed the evidence independently and find it compelling. I believe Howard would want us to take decisive action to protect his legacy. After a brief discussion, all three board members signed the necessary documents, officially supporting Margaret's invocation of the dissolution provision. Just as they finished, the conference room door opened, and Victoria Hayes entered, her expression shifting from surprise to controlled neutrality. Margaret, you're early. I was just preparing the reports you requested. Her gaze swept over the gathered group, lingering on the legal documents. I didn't realize we were having a board meeting. Not a full board meeting, Margaret replied calmly. Just addressing some concerns that have come to my attention. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. What concerns as executive director? I should be informed of any operational issues. These concerns involve potential financial irregularities, Margaret said, watching Victoria's reaction carefully. Including the Phoenix Project. A flicker of something alarm calculation crossed Victoria's face before her professional mask returned. The Phoenix Project has experienced some delays, but Richard assures me they're temporary. Perhaps I should call him to join us. That won't be necessary, Margaret said. He's already on his way. As if on cue, the conference room door opened again, and Richard entered, his expression a careful mixture of concern and confusion. Margaret, darling, I was told you were already here. Is everything all right with your friend? My friend is recovering. Thank you, Margaret replied, not bothering to maintain the pretense. We're discussing some concerning financial matters. Richard, perhaps you'd like to join us. Richard took in the assembled group, his gaze lingering on William Peterson and Samuel Goldman, whose presence clearly surprised him. Of course, though I wish you'd mentioned your concerns to me privately first. Like you mentioned the unauthorized board meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Margaret countered. Richard's composure slipped momentarily before he recovered. A preliminary budget discussion. Nothing formal. I didn't want to bother you with administrative details. A preliminary discussion that would have authorized the transfer of 3 foundation properties to Horizon Development. Margaret pushed a document across the table, a draft resolution James had obtained from his source. A company that, remarkably, shares an address with one of Westlake Development's subsidiaries. Richard's expression hardened, the genial mask falling away. You've been investigating me. Yes, Margaret acknowledged simply. Just as Howard was before his death. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Victoria moved to stand beside Richard, her loyalty now unmistakable. These are serious allegations, Richard said, his voice controlled but cold. Based on what appears to be illegally obtained information and speculation, I suggest we adjourn until legal counsel for all parties can be present. An excellent suggestion, Samuel interjected, sliding another document forward. As legal counsel to the Sullivan Foundation since its inception, I've prepared this notice formally invoking the dissolution provision contained in the Foundation Charter. Effective immediately, the current board of directors is dissolved, and an interim board consisting of Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, Dr. Chen, Mr. Daniels, and Mr. Washington will assume leadership pending a thorough investigation. Victoria paled. You can't do this. The full board must vote on leadership changes. Not under these circumstances, Samuel corrected. The provision explicitly grants Mrs. Sullivan Coleman this authority in cases of suspected malfeasance, subject to the support of at least 3 founding-era board members, which she has secured. Richard's expression darkened with genuine anger. This is absurd. You're acting on paranoid suspicions without due process or evidence. We have evidence, Mr. Coleman, William said calmly. Or should I say, Mr. Caldwell, evidence of similar schemes at 3 other foundations where you held leadership positions. Evidence of fraudulent transactions involving the Phoenix Project. Evidence of your meetings with Jonathan Pierce to arrange property transfers without proper board approval. Circumstantial at best, Richard scoffed, though his confidence was visibly shaken. Perhaps, Margaret agreed, but sufficient to justify invoking the dissolution provision and launching a formal investigation, an investigation that will include forensic accounting of all foundation transactions during your tenure, interviews with officials from other foundations you've been associated with, and a re-examination of the circumstances surrounding Howard's death. At the mention of Howard's death, Richard's eyes narrowed. Careful, Margaret. Grief can lead people to construct elaborate fantasies. Howard died of natural causes, tragic but not mysterious. We'll see what the investigation reveals, Margaret replied evenly. In the meantime, Foundation assets have been frozen, security protocols have been changed, and both of you are suspended from all duties pending the outcome of our inquiry. Victoria finally broke her silence. This is how you repay 30 years of loyalty. I've given my life to this foundation. Margaret met her gaze directly. And received generous compensation for your service. Tell me, Victoria, did Synergy Healthcare offer additional incentives when they hired your brother 2 months before Howard died? Or was undermining your mentor's life work reward enough? Victoria flinched as if struck. You don't understand. Howard was becoming paranoid, making reckless accusations, threatening valuable partnerships. Someone had to protect the foundation from his increasing instability. By facilitating his murder, Margaret asked quietly. The room fell silent. Richard placed a restraining hand on Victoria's arm, but she shook it off. Howard wasn't murdered, Victoria insisted, though her voice wavered. He had a heart condition he kept private. The stress of his conspiracy theories aggravated it. A convenient explanation, Margaret observed. But we'll let the investigation determine the truth. Security will escort you both from the building. Your personal belongings will be cataloged and delivered to your homes after they've been reviewed for foundation property. Richard's mask of civility dissolved completely. You think you've won. You have no idea who you're dealing with or what resources we have. By this time tomorrow, you'll be facing injunctions, psychiatric evaluations, and public humiliation. Threats noted and recorded, Samuel replied mildly, gesturing to the surveillance equipment. Perhaps not the wisest strategy. Mr. Coleman. Security personnel entered the conference room, positioning themselves near Richard and Victoria. Richard glanced at them, then back at Margaret, his expression calculating. You're making a terrible mistake, he said, his voice suddenly gentle, almost regretful. I truly cared for you, Margaret. This vendetta will only bring you pain. Save the performance, Margaret replied coldly. You never cared for anything except access to the Foundation's assets. Our entire marriage was a calculated business strategy, one that has failed spectacularly. As security escorted them out, Margaret maintained her composed exterior, though internally she was processing the painful confirmation of Richard's betrayal and Victoria's complicity. Only when the door closed behind them did she allow herself a moment of visible emotion, removing Howard's pearl necklace from a hidden pocket and fastening it around her neck once more. Phase 1 complete, she said quietly. Now we prepare for their counterattack. She didn't have to wait long. By evening, their legal team had received notice of emergency injunctions filed by Richard's attorneys, challenging the validity of the dissolution provision and Margaret's mental competence to invoke it. Simultaneously, a statement was released to select media outlets suggesting that Margaret Sullivan Coleman was suffering from paranoid delusions following a series of concerning behaviors noted by family and colleagues. They're moving quickly, Samuel observed as they gathered in Margaret's home office, swept clean of surveillance devices that afternoon. The mental competence angle is particularly aggressive. And predictable, Margaret replied. Discredit the accuser when you can't refute the accusations. Classic deflection strategy. They've also frozen your personal accounts, William added grimly. Claiming potential commingling of personal and foundation assets requiring court supervision, Margaret smiled, surprising them. Fortunately, Howard taught me to prepare for financial siege. She opened a hidden wall safe, removing several file folders, accounts they don't know about, emergency funds, and documentation of all personal assets separate from foundation holdings. James, his injuries properly treated and bandaged, joined them with Eleanor. My editor has agreed to run the first piece of our investigation tomorrow. Not the full expose yet, but enough to establish that there's substance behind your actions. He's also arranged for a trusted colleague at the Globe to provide independent coverage. Excellent, Margaret approved. The court of public opinion will be as important as the legal battle. What about the emergency board meeting they had planned for tomorrow? Elizabeth Chen asked. Will they still attempt to proceed with it? Almost certainly, William replied. They'll claim our actions were invalid and proceed as if the dissolution never occurred. They still have relationships with the board members we haven't reached yet. Let them meet, Margaret decided. We'll have legal observers present to document every action they take in defiance of the dissolution notice. Each move they make against established protocol will strengthen our case. As they continued strategizing late into the night, Margaret received an unexpected call from the hospital. Sophia Martinez had regained consciousness and was asking for her urgently. I need to go, Margaret told the others. Eleanor, would you accompany me, James? Stay here where it's secure. William, Samuel, please continue preparing for tomorrow's legal challenges. At Massachusetts General Hospital, Margaret found Sophia sitting up in her ICU bed, bruised but alert, a police officer stationed outside her door. Margaret, Sophia grasped her hand with surprising strength. You need to know they found me. Who found you? Margaret asked, alarmed. Pierce's people. A man came to my room, posing as a doctor. He was searching for something. Sophia's voice was urgent despite her weakness. The security guard stopped him, but he'll try again. What was he looking for? Eleanor asked. This. Sophia painfully reached beneath her pillow, extracting a small data card. Howard gave it to me for safekeeping the week before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you received it, but only if you came asking the right questions. Margaret took the card, her hands trembling slightly. What's on it? A complete record of the scheme names, dates, financial transactions, recorded conversations. Howard had been building the case for over a year. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. He knew they might come after him, but he thought documenting everything would protect him. He didn't understand how far they would go. Or he understood exactly and created this insurance policy, Eleanor suggested, making sure the truth would eventually come out, even if he couldn't deliver it himself. Margaret clutched the data card, overwhelmed by Howard's foresight and the tragic reality that it hadn't saved his life. Thank you for protecting this, Sophia. We'll make sure it reaches the right authorities. There's something else, Sophia added, her voice dropping to a whisper. Victoria was the one who told them about the research facility, about the records Howard was keeping. She betrayed him first, before Richard ever entered the picture. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Victoria's betrayal hadn't been recent or reluctant. It had been the catalyst for everything that followed, including possibly Howard's death. Why? Margaret asked, the single word containing all her pain and confusion. Howard changed his will 6 months before he died, Sophia explained. Previously, Victoria had been named to succeed him as foundation director with significant autonomy. The new will gave that authority solely to you, with Victoria remaining in her executive role but reporting directly to you. He never told me, Margaret murmured. He was going to, once he completed his investigation. He wanted all the pieces in place first. Sophia's eyes drifted closed, her strength waning. Victoria found out about the change from the attorney's office. She was furious, felt betrayed after 30 years of service. That's when Synergy approached her brother with a job offer, and her the opportunity for revenge. As Sophia drifted back to sleep, Margaret and Eleanor returned to the hallway, processing this new information. We need to get this data to a secure location immediately, Eleanor said, and make multiple copies. Margaret nodded, her mind racing. Howard created a comprehensive case against them, and they killed him for it. Now we have exactly what they've been trying to prevent from coming to light for 5 years, which makes you an even bigger target, Eleanor warned. They'll escalate now, become more desperate. Let them, Margaret replied, a cold determination settling over her. I'm done playing defense. Back at Margaret's home, they connected the data card to a secure computer, revealing an extraordinary archive of information. Howard had been more thorough than they could have imagined, recording conversations, tracking financial transactions, documenting board manipulation tactics, and even photographing clandestine meetings between Westlake Synergy representatives and Foundation insiders. Most damning was a recorded conversation between Victoria and a Synergy executive, discussing Howard's health concerns and how a medical solution might be necessary if he continued his investigation. While not explicitly discussing murder, the implications were clear enough to justify a criminal investigation. This is the smoking gun, James said, reviewing the files with growing excitement. With this evidence, we can go beyond civil actions against the Foundation Board. We're looking at potential criminal charges, conspiracy, fraud, possibly even murder. We need to secure this evidence with the authorities immediately, William advised. The FBI would be appropriate given the multi-state nature of the scheme. First thing tomorrow, Margaret agreed. Tonight, we prepare our public response to their attacks on my competence. When they move against us in court tomorrow, we'll be ready with Howard's evidence and public opinion on our side. The next morning dawned with a media firestorm. Richard's camp had been busy, with sympathetic outlets running stories questioning Margaret's mental stability and suggesting the Foundation dissolution was the act of a grieving widow unable to accept her husband's natural death. Simultaneously, however, the Boston Chronicle published James's initial investigation into the Westlake Synergy connection, documenting the pattern of foundation takeovers and fraudulent real estate schemes. The balanced reporting lent credibility to Margaret's actions, creating public doubt about Richard's narrative. By 9, Margaret was meeting with FBI agents, turning over Howard's evidence and providing her own testimony about recent events. The agents, initially skeptical, became increasingly engaged as they reviewed Howard's meticulous documentation. This is extraordinary material, Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, the lead agent acknowledged. It will take time to analyze fully, but there's clearly sufficient evidence to open a formal investigation. Time is precisely what we don't have, Margaret pressed. They're moving aggressively to regain control of the foundation and its assets. Once that happens, evidence will disappear. Witnesses will be pressured, and the entire scheme will continue. We understand the urgency, the agent assured her. We'll expedite the review process and take appropriate action as quickly as possible. As Margaret left the federal building, she received an urgent call from Samuel Goldman. They've scheduled an emergency court hearing for noon today. Judge Lawrence Crawford, known to be friendly with several current board members. Of course they'd forum shop, Margaret replied, unsurprised. What's the specific motion? A temporary restraining order invalidating the dissolution provision, reinstating the board, and requiring psychiatric evaluation before you can exercise any authority over foundation matters. Samuel's voice carried professional outrage. It's aggressive and borderline defamatory. It's also desperate, Margaret observed. Have William meet us at the courthouse and alert our media contacts. I want this hearing covered extensively. By noon, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Margaret ascended them with deliberate confidence, flanked by William, Samuel, and the 3 loyal board members. Inside, Richard and Victoria were already seated with their legal team, a phalanx of expensive suits from one of Boston's most prestigious firms. Judge Crawford, a corpulent man in his 60s with a reputation for favoring established interests, regarded Margaret with thinly veiled skepticism as she entered. Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, he began after preliminaries. These are extraordinary circumstances. Your attorneys have invoked an obscure provision to unilaterally dissolve a board of distinguished community leaders based on allegations that, frankly, strain credulity. With respect, Your Honor, Samuel countered. The provision in question was legally incorporated into the foundation charter by its founder, Howard Sullivan, specifically to address the possibility of internal malfeasance. The evidence supporting Mrs. Sullivan Coleman's actions is substantial and compelling. Richard's lead attorney, a polished woman with a shark-like intensity, rose. Your Honor, we have affidavits from multiple board members expressing concern about Mrs. Sullivan Coleman's increasingly erratic behavior following her friend's accident. We believe she is suffering from psychological distress that has manifested in paranoid ideation about her husband and foundation colleagues. Margaret remained impassive, though internally she noted the tactical error. They were overplaying the mental health angle without sufficient substantiation. Furthermore, the attorney continued, we have documentation showing that the so-called dissolution provision was never properly ratified by the full board, making its invocation procedurally invalid. Samuel was prepared for this argument. The provision didn't require board ratification. Your Honor, as founder and primary benefactor, Howard Sullivan retained certain unilateral authorities in the foundation, charter authorities explicitly designed to protect against the very situation we now face. The legal arguments continued for nearly an hour, with both sides presenting increasingly technical interpretations of foundation bylaws and charter provisions. Throughout, Margaret remained composed, making notes and occasionally whispering suggestions to Samuel. Finally, Judge Crawford sighed heavily. This is clearly a complex matter requiring more extensive review. For now, I am inclined to grant a temporary stay of the dissolution action, returning the foundation to status quo ante, pending a full hearing next week. Just as he prepared to formalize this ruling, the courtroom doors opened, and a distinguished older man in an immaculate suit entered, accompanied by 2 federal agents. Your Honor, the man announced, I apologize for the interruption. I'm United States Attorney Francis Blackwell. I'm here regarding the Sullivan Foundation matter before you. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The U.S. attorney rarely appeared personally for routine proceedings. Judge Crawford frowned at the interruption. Mr. Blackwell, this is a civil matter concerning foundation governance. I fail to see the federal interest. With respect, Your Honor, this morning the FBI opened a formal investigation into allegations of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and potential violations of the RICO Act involving several parties before you today. Blackwell approached the bench, handing over documents. These are copies of the initial filings, including requests that certain foundation assets be preserved as potential evidence. Richard visibly paled, whispering urgently to his attorney. Victoria's composure finally cracked, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Judge Crawford reviewed the documents with growing concern. This appears to be in order, but I don't see how it prevents me from ruling on the governance issue before me. The federal investigation directly concerns the legitimacy of certain board members' actions and potential criminal conspiracy involving foundation assets, Blackwell explained. Any ruling restoring their authority could potentially interfere with an active federal investigation and allow for the destruction of evidence. After further legal arguments, Judge Crawford reluctantly modified his ruling. In light of the federal interest in this matter, I am ordering that the current interim board remain in place, pending both the federal investigation and a full hearing on the dissolution provision next week. The Foundation's assets will remain frozen except for ongoing charitable commitments previously approved. As the court adjourned, Richard caught Margaret's eye across the room, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. Margaret held his gaze steadily, offering no reaction. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters clamored for statements. Richard and Victoria hurried to a waiting car, ignoring questions. Margaret, however, stepped forward with William and Samuel beside her. The Sullivan Foundation exists to serve the most vulnerable members of our community, she stated clearly. Today's ruling ensures that mission continues uninterrupted while serious concerns about financial management are addressed. I remain committed to protecting my late husband's legacy and the Foundation's vital work. As cameras flashed, a reporter called out, "Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, your husband Richard has suggested you're experiencing mental health issues. How do you respond?" Margaret smiled slightly. "I practiced law in Boston for 30 years before retiring to work alongside Howard. During that time, I prosecuted some of the most complex financial fraud cases in the Commonwealth's history. My mental acuity was legendary, then it remains undiminished now." The subtle reminder of her professional background deliberately downplayed during her years as Richard's wife sent a clear message. Margaret Sullivan was not merely a vulnerable widow. She was a formidable opponent who had spent decades outsmarting financial criminals in courtrooms across Massachusetts. As they left the courthouse, William squeezed her arm supportively. "Howard would be proud. That was masterfully handled." "It's just the beginning," Margaret replied. "They've lost the first battle, but they'll regroup quickly. We need to prepare for their next move." That move came sooner than expected. As Margaret returned to her Beacon Hill home that afternoon, she found the front door slightly ajar, a door she knew had been securely locked when she left. Drawing on decades of caution, she backed away quietly, calling Eleanor from her car. Within minutes, Eleanor arrived with two trusted security personnel, who entered and cleared the house. Inside, they found clear evidence of a rushed but thorough search, drawers partially open, books displaced on shelves, Howard's study particularly disturbed. They were looking for Howard's evidence. Margaret realized, surveying the damage. They don't know we've already turned everything over to the FBI. Or they're searching for something else, something we haven't found yet, Eleanor suggested. Margaret considered this possibility. Howard was thorough. If he created one backup, he likely created others. As they began assessing what might have been taken, Margaret's phone rang an unknown number. She answered cautiously, "Mrs. Sullivan Coleman." The voice was male, unfamiliar, and deliberately modulated. "You've become a significant inconvenience." "Who is this?" Margaret demanded, signaling Eleanor to try tracing the call. "Someone with the authority to offer you a one-time opportunity. Withdraw your accusations, reinstate the board, and return to your comfortable life as a wealthy widow. In exchange, your son remains unharmed." Margaret's blood froze. "James is perfectly safe." A low chuckle. "Is he? When did you last see him? When did you last speak with him?" Margaret maintained her composure with effort. James had left her home that morning to meet with his editor, a meeting she'd confirmed had occurred, but that had been hours ago. "If you've harmed my son, that depends entirely on your next actions," the voice interrupted. "You have until midnight to publicly announce your withdrawal from Foundation matters, citing health concerns. After that, we cannot guarantee your son's safety." The call ended abruptly. Eleanor shook her head, not enough time for a trace. "James," Margaret whispered, immediately dialing his number. The call went straight to voicemail. "It could be a bluff," Eleanor said, though her expression was grave. "Trying to leverage your greatest vulnerability? Or they've actually taken him." Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. "We need to confirm his movements today without alerting them that we're searching." For the next hour, they discreetly tracked James's last known locations. His editor confirmed he had left the Chronicle offices around 1 p.m., mentioning plans to meet a source about the Westlake story. Subsequent calls to his usual contacts yielded nothing. Just as Margaret was preparing to contact the FBI, her phone chimed with a text message from James's phone, but clearly not from James Midnight. Public statement of withdrawal. Or the next story your son writes will be his obituary. Attached was a photo of James, unconscious, his face bruised, held upright by an unseen person. Margaret stared at the image, a cold fury replacing her initial fear. These people had murdered Howard, targeted Sophia, corrupted Victoria, manipulated Margaret herself through a fraudulent marriage, and now threatened her son. The line had been crossed. Call the FBI, she instructed Eleanor. And then call William and Samuel. It's time for our contingency plan. You're not considering giving in, Eleanor asked, already dialing. No, Margaret replied, her voice hardening with resolve. I'm considering ending this permanently. As night fell over Boston, two parallel operations unfolded. Publicly, Margaret appeared to be complying with the kidnappers' demands, having her attorney contact media outlets about an upcoming statement. Privately, FBI agents were tracking cellular data from James's phone, narrowing down possible locations where he might be held. In Margaret's home, now secured by private security and FBI personnel, a command center had been established. Margaret herself sat at the center of activity, her expression determined as she reviewed building plans for a waterfront warehouse, identified as the most likely location. We have thermal imaging showing 3 individuals on the second floor, the FBI tactical leader reported. 1 stationary, likely your son, and 2 moving around the space. What's your proposed approach? Margaret asked, her calm demeanor belying the turmoil beneath. Standard hostage protocol: secure the perimeter, attempt negotiation, enter with tactical team if necessary. Margaret nodded, then surprised them with her next question. And if I told you I could guarantee the kidnappers would exit the building, leaving my son inside, within the next 30 minutes? The agent looked skeptical. How would you accomplish that? By giving them exactly what they want, Margaret replied, or what they think they want. At precisely 11:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the kidnappers' deadline, Margaret's attorney released a statement to selected media outlets. Due to recent health concerns and on the advice of my physicians, I am temporarily stepping back from involvement with the Sullivan Foundation. I regret any disruption caused by my actions and withdraw all allegations against board members and foundation officers. Simultaneously, a text was sent from Margaret's phone to the kidnappers. Statement released. Now, release my son as promised. Within minutes, surveillance teams observed movement at the warehouse, 2 individuals exiting, entering a black SUV, and departing. They were immediately followed by unmarked vehicles, while the tactical team prepared to enter the warehouse to recover James. What the kidnappers didn't know was that Margaret's statement had been released only to a closed media list trusted journalists who had agreed to embargo the information for 24 hours as part of the FBI operation. No public announcement had actually occurred. As federal agents stormed the warehouse, securing the location and finding James bound but alive, other teams intercepted the departing SUV. Inside were Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Westlake Development, and a private security contractor with ties to Richard. Back at Margaret's home, as reports of the successful operation came in, she allowed herself a moment of relief. James was safe, 2 key conspirators were in custody, and the trap had been sprung perfectly. We've got them, Eleanor said, watching the updates, but Richard and Victoria are still unaccounted for. Not for long, Margaret replied, a grim satisfaction in her voice. Pierce will talk to save himself. By morning, federal agents will have the entire network. As if on cue, her phone rang the FBI team leader. Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, we've recovered your son. He's being transported to Massachusetts General now. Minor injuries, but he'll be fine. Thank you, Margaret said, emotion finally breaking through her composed exterior. And the others? Pierce is already offering information in exchange for consideration. Based on his initial statements, we're executing warrants at multiple locations, including your husband's current residence and Ms. Hayes' apartment. Margaret nodded, though the agent couldn't see her. Keep me informed, please. As dawn broke over Boston the next morning, Margaret sat beside James's hospital bed, watching her son sleep. The bruises on his face were vivid against his pale skin, but his breathing was steady, his prognosis excellent. Eleanor entered quietly, carrying coffee. They've arrested Richard, she reported, trying to board a private plane at Hanscom Field. Victoria surrendered at her sister's home in Cambridge. And the foundation? Margaret asked. Secure. The FBI has frozen all suspicious transactions, and Samuel is working with forensic accountants to trace and recover diverted funds. Eleanor handed Margaret a cup. It's over, Margaret. You've won. Margaret shook her head slightly. Not yet. There's one more thing Howard would want me to do. 2 days later, as federal indictments were being prepared against 11 individuals connected to the Sullivan Foundation fraud scheme, Margaret called a press conference. With James beside her, still showing the marks of his ordeal, she addressed the assembled media with quiet dignity. 5 years ago, my husband Howard Sullivan died while trying to protect the foundation he had built and the vulnerable communities it serves. Today, we know his death was not natural, but the result of a calculated criminal conspiracy. She paused, allowing the murmurs to subside before continuing. In honor of Howard's memory and to continue his mission, I am announcing the restructuring of the Sullivan Foundation with enhanced transparency, independent oversight, and renewed commitment to our core values. Additionally, I am establishing the Howard Sullivan Investigative Fund, dedicated to exposing and prosecuting financial crimes against charitable organizations nationwide. A reporter called out, "Mrs. Sullivan Coleman, will you be returning to your law career?" Margaret smiled slightly. Not in the traditional sense, but as Howard often reminded me, true wealth isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we give away, including our time, our expertise, and our passionate advocacy for those who need it most. As cameras flashed, Margaret stood straight and proud, her hand resting lightly on Howard's pearl necklace. The predators who had targeted her family and her husband's legacy had discovered, too late, the dangerous miscalculation they had made. They had mistaken a gracious withdrawal from professional life for weakness. They had seen only a wealthy widow, not the strategic mind and steely determination that had once made Margaret Sullivan the most feared prosecutor in Massachusetts. Most fatally, they had failed to understand that when you threaten what Margaret Sullivan treasures most, her family and her principles, you awaken not just an opponent, but an implacable force of justice that will not rest until balance is restored. In his final letter, Howard had written that Margaret possessed both her mother's wisdom and his stubborn streak. As the criminal conspirators faced decades in federal prison and the Sullivan Foundation emerged stronger than ever, the truth of Howard's assessment was undeniable. Margaret Sullivan had not just protected his legacy, she had transformed it into something even more powerful, a living testament to the principle that one person, with courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice, can triumph over even the most sophisticated networks of corruption and greed. Legacy secured, justice served, a new chapter beginning. The Boston evening settled over the harbor as Margaret stood at the window of Howard's old study, his presence somehow stronger now than it had been in years. The pearl necklace hung comfortably against her throat once more, no longer a weight, but a reminder. 5 defendants had received their sentences that morning. Richard would spend 20 years contemplating the woman he had so catastrophically underestimated. Victoria, 15 years to consider the price of betrayal. The others, scattered through the federal prison system like fallen chess pieces. Margaret traced her finger along the spines of Howard's books, feeling not triumph, but a quiet restoration of balance. The cost had been steep 5 years of her life living with her husband's killer, the loss of a friendship 3 decades deep, her son's brush with death, and the innocence that comes with believing you know the people closest to you. Yet what remained was stronger than what had been taken. The foundation, now a beacon of transparency and purpose, her own voice, reclaimed from the margins where they had tried to silence it, and the truth, that final powerful gift Howard had entrusted to her keeping. In the gathering twilight, she smiled softly, remembering how they had mistaken her grace for weakness, her patience for surrender, her age for irrelevance. How dangerous it is to believe that wolves lose their teeth with time.